What if I told you that the secret to a meaningful life isn't avoiding pain, but understanding why it exists in the first place? Leo Tolstoy, one of history's greatest writers, spent decades wrestling with this exact question, and what he discovered might completely change how you see your own suffering. This isn't just about some Russian novelist from the 1800s. This is about why you feel the way you do right now, why nothing seems to satisfy you for long, and why the moments of deepest pain in your life might actually be pointing you towards something profound. Tolstoy wasn't always the wise sage we think of today. For most of his early life, he was lost, searching for meaning in all the wrong places. Born into aristocracy in 1828, he had everything the world told him should make him happy: wealth, status, land, and later, literary fame that made him one of the most celebrated authors alive. But here's the thing, none of it worked. He chased pleasure after pleasure, indulged in gambling, drinking, womanizing, convinced that the next experience would finally fill the void inside him. It never did. He wrote about this period of his life with brutal honesty, admitting that he was living like an animal, driven purely by appetites and desires, with no higher purpose guiding him. And the worst part? Even when he achieved massive success with War and Peace and Anna Karenina, even when the entire world was praising his genius, he felt more empty than ever. This is where Tolstoy's journey gets interesting, because it's also where most of us find ourselves at some point. He had checked all the boxes society tells us to check. He was rich, famous, married with children, accomplished beyond measure, and yet he was miserable. He described lying in bed at night, unable to sleep, tormented by a single question that wouldn't leave him alone. What's the point of any of this? Why should I continue living if everything I do is ultimately meaningless? He wasn't being dramatic, he was genuinely suicidal, and he had to hide ropes from himself because he was afraid he'd hang himself. He couldn't keep hunting rifles in his study because he didn't trust himself not to use them. This was a man who had everything, and he wanted to die. So what changed? How did Tolstoy go from the brink of suicide to becoming one of the most spiritually influential thinkers of his time? The answer lies in how he reframed suffering itself. Tolstoy realized that his suffering wasn't a problem to be solved or an obstacle to be removed. It was a message, a signal that something fundamental about the way he was living was wrong. Most people, when they suffer, immediately ask, how can I make this stop? Tolstoy asked a different question. What is this suffering trying to teach me? He began studying philosophy and religion with an obsessive intensity, reading everything he could find from Eastern and Western traditions, trying to understand how different cultures and thinkers had dealt with the problem of suffering. And he noticed something crucial. The peasants and working people around him, people who had far less than he did in material terms, often seemed more content, more grounded, more at peace. They weren't happier because they had less suffering. They suffered plenty. They had hard lives, physical labor, poverty, loss. But they had something Tolstoy lacked, a framework for understanding why that suffering existed and what it meant. This led Tolstoy to one of his most important insights. Suffering is inevitable, but meaningless suffering is unbearable. The problem wasn't that he was suffering. The problem was that his entire worldview made that suffering pointless. If life is just about accumulating pleasures and avoiding pains, then suffering becomes this absurd cosmic joke, something that shouldn't exist but does anyway. But if suffering has a purpose, if it's teaching you something, or refining you, or pointing you toward a deeper truth, then suddenly it transforms from meaningless torture into meaningful growth. Think about it in your own life. The worst suffering isn't necessarily the most physically painful. It's the suffering that feels pointless. A difficult workout can be intensely painful, but you endure it because you know it's making you stronger. Childbirth is excruciating, but parents describe it as meaningful pain because of what it produces. But random chronic pain, suffering that seems to serve no purpose, that's what breaks people. Tolstoy understood that humans can endure almost anything if they know why they're enduring it. But even small sufferings become unbearable when they seem meaningless. So Tolstoy set out to construct a new framework for understanding life, one that made suffering make sense. He drew heavily from Christian teachings, but not the institutional Christianity of the Russian Orthodox Church, which he came to see as corrupt and hypocritical. Instead, he went back to what he saw as the core teachings, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, and extracted what he believed were universal spiritual truths. And one of those truths was this: suffering exists because we're attached to the wrong things. This is where Tolstoy's philosophy gets really practical. He argued that most of our suffering comes from a fundamental confusion about what will make us happy. We think that if we just get enough money, enough success, enough pleasure, enough admiration from others, then we'll be satisfied. But this is a trap, because all of these things are temporary and external. They're outside our control, and they can never provide lasting fulfillment. He wrote extensively about this in his later works, explaining that every time we place our happiness in something external, we're setting ourselves up for inevitable suffering, because everything external is impermanent. Look at his own life as the proof. He achieved literary immortality. His books are still read 150 years later, and it meant nothing to him in terms of happiness. He was wealthy beyond measure, and it brought him no peace. He had a family, and while he loved them, they also became a source of tremendous conflict and pain. Everything he thought would save him not only failed to save him, but often made things worse. This wasn't because these things were inherently bad. It was because he had made them into false gods. He had believed they could provide something they were never designed to provide: ultimate meaning and purpose. Tolstoy came to believe that true meaning could only come from what he called living for the soul, rather than living for the body. By the soul, he meant the eternal, unchanging part of human existence, the part that connects to something beyond individual ego and personal desire. And by the body, he meant everything temporary: physical pleasures, social status, material possessions, even personal relationships in their earthly form. When you live for the body, you're constantly afraid because everything you value can be taken away. You're always chasing the next pleasure, the next achievement, the next validation, and it's exhausting and ultimately futile. But when you live for the soul, when you orient your life around principles and values that transcend individual circumstances, suffering transforms into something else entirely. This is where Tolstoy's ideas connect directly to your life right now. Think about what causes you the most anxiety and suffering. Chances are it's related to something external that you're afraid of losing, or something external you're afraid you won't get. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's someone's approval. Maybe it's your health, or your appearance, or your status. And Tolstoy would say that this suffering is inevitable as long as you continue to believe that these external things are where your ultimate value and meaning come from. The suffering isn't random. It's revealing something true, that you've invested your sense of self in things that are by nature impermanent and unreliable. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Tolstoy didn't just say, accept that everything is meaningless and give up. That was the mistake of the nihilists and pessimists of his time. Instead, he said there is profound meaning, but it exists in a different dimension than we usually look for it. The meaning isn't in getting what you want, it's in becoming who you're meant to be. And suffering, paradoxically, is often the primary tool for that transformation. He wrote about this beautifully in his later stories and essays. Suffering strips away illusions. It forces you to confront what really matters. It burns away the superficial and reveals the essential. Think about the major growth periods in your own life. Weren't they often connected to times of difficulty? Not because difficulty is fun or pleasant, but because it forced you to let go of things that weren't serving you, forced you to develop strengths you didn't know you had, forced you to clarify what you actually value versus what you thought you were supposed to value. Tolstoy observed this pattern everywhere, in his own experience and in the world around him. The comfortable life he had lived in his youth had made him weak and confused, chasing pleasure after pleasure without ever having to develop real character or conviction. It was only when he hit rock bottom, when he was genuinely contemplating suicide, that he was forced to completely rebuild his understanding of life from the ground up. And that rebuilding process, painful as it was, led him to insights that not only saved his own life, but have influenced millions of people since. One of the most powerful examples of this is in his short story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which many consider his greatest work. It's about a successful judge who has lived his entire life according to society's rules, doing everything right, climbing the ladder, maintaining appearances, and then he gets sick with a terminal illness. As he's dying, he's forced to confront the fact that his entire life has been a lie, that he's never actually lived authentically, never pursued what truly mattered, never connected deeply with anyone, including himself. And the story is devastating because you realize this is exactly how Tolstoy saw his own earlier life, as a kind of death, a walking through the motions without ever really being alive. But the crucial part, the part that makes it not just tragic but meaningful, is that even Ilyich, in his final moments, has a realization. He understands what went wrong. He sees that all his suffering came from living the wrong kind of life, from mistaking the shadow for the substance. And in that moment of clarity, even though he's dying, even though it's too late to change his external circumstances, something shifts. His suffering transforms, not because it goes away, but because he finally understands what it was trying to teach him all along. Tolstoy wrote that in that moment, even Ilyich stopped caring about death, stopped being afraid, because he had finally touched something real, something that death couldn't take away. This is the heart of Tolstoy's message about suffering. It's not about eliminating it, it's about understanding it, learning from it, letting it transform you rather than destroy you. And this requires a complete shift in how you think about your life. Instead of asking, how can I be comfortable? You start asking, how can I grow? Instead of demanding, why is this happening to me? You start asking, what is this trying to teach me? Instead of seeing obstacles as unfair punishments, you start seeing them as necessary friction that shapes you into someone stronger, wiser, more compassionate. Tolstoy also made another crucial observation. Suffering connects us to others in a way that pleasure never can. When you're comfortable and successful, it's easy to feel separate, superior, isolated in your own bubble. But suffering is universal. Everyone experiences it. Everyone struggles. Everyone faces loss and pain and disappointment. And when you stop trying to pretend that you're above it all, when you stop hiding your struggles and admit your vulnerability, you discover genuine connection with other human beings. You realize that your suffering isn't unique or special. It's part of the human condition, and there's something oddly comforting about that. He wrote about this in his later years, especially in works like Resurrection, where the protagonist goes through a spiritual transformation that involves recognizing his connection to all humanity, especially to those who suffer. Tolstoy came to believe that one of the purposes of suffering was to break down the artificial walls we build between ourselves and others, the walls of ego and pride and self-importance. When you suffer, truly suffer, you can't maintain those walls anymore. You're forced to admit that you're not in control, that you're vulnerable, that you need others, that you're fundamentally the same as everyone else struggling through life. This led Tolstoy to some radical conclusions about how to live. He became increasingly critical of wealth, privilege, and social hierarchy, seeing them as obstacles to genuine human connection and spiritual growth. He gave away much of his money, dressed in peasant clothes, worked in the fields, tried to live as simply as possible. His family thought he was going insane, and his wife was furious with him for giving away their wealth. But from Tolstoy's perspective, he was finally becoming sane, finally aligning his life with what he had learned through his suffering. Now, you don't have to become an ascetic or give away all your possessions to learn from Tolstoy's insights. That's not the point. The point is to understand the principle. Attachment to external things creates suffering, and the solution isn't to get more external things or different external things. It's to fundamentally change your relationship with them, to hold them lightly, to enjoy them when they're present, but not depend on them for your sense of meaning or identity. To recognize that they're temporary, and that's okay, because the real you, the soul, the consciousness, the values you choose to embody, those things are more fundamental and more lasting. Tolstoy also emphasized that this transformation doesn't happen through intellectual understanding alone. You can't just think your way out of suffering. You have to live your way through it. He wrote extensively about the importance of moral action, of actually embodying the principles you claim to believe in. This is why he became so focused on nonviolence, on serving others, on living simply and honestly. These weren't just nice ideas for him. They were practices, disciplines that trained him to live from the soul rather than the body, to orient his life around eternal values rather than temporary circumstances. And here's something crucial that Tolstoy understood about suffering that many people miss. It's not a one-time lesson. You don't suffer once, learn your lesson, and then live happily ever after. Suffering is recurring because you keep forgetting. You keep falling back into old patterns. Keep investing your identity in temporary things. Keep chasing after what can never truly satisfy you. So suffering keeps returning to remind you, to redirect you, to call you back to what actually matters. And if you see it this way, as a teacher rather than an enemy, as a course correction rather than a punishment, then even recurring suffering becomes bearable, even meaningful. Tolstoy spent the last decades of his life writing about these ideas, trying to share what he had learned through his own dark night of the soul. He wrote moral tales and parables. He wrote essays on religion and philosophy. He wrote about education and social reform. And the common thread through all of it was this: life becomes meaningful when you stop running from suffering and start learning from it. When you stop placing your hope in things that can't bear that weight and start building your life on a foundation that won't crumble. When you stop living for yourself alone and start connecting to something larger, whether you call it God or humanity or truth or love. One of his most famous later works, A Confession, is completely about this journey. It's his honest account of his spiritual crisis and how he found his way through it. And what's striking about it is how relatable it is, even now, more than a century later. The questions he was asking are the same questions people ask today. What's the point of all this? Why should I keep going when everything seems futile? How can I find meaning in a world that often feels meaningless? And his answers aren't simple platitudes or easy reassurances. They're hard-won insights from someone who genuinely went through the fire and came out the other side. Tolstoy would say that your suffering right now, whatever form it takes, is not an accident, not a mistake, not evidence that something has gone wrong with your life. It's evidence that you're alive, that you're human, that you're capable of growth and transformation. The question isn't whether you'll suffer. The question is what you'll do with that suffering. Will you let it make you bitter, cynical, closed off? Will you spend your life trying to avoid it, numbing yourself, running from anything that might hurt? Or will you do what Tolstoy did, turn toward it, examine it, ask what it's trying to teach you, and let it shape you into someone deeper, wiser, more fully human? He believed that every person has the capacity for this transformation, that it's not reserved for saints or sages or special people. It's available to anyone who's willing to be honest about their suffering. to stop pretending they have it all figured out, to admit that the way they've been living isn't working, and to genuinely seek a better way. And the beautiful thing is that once you start this process, once you begin to see suffering as meaningful rather than meaningless, everything shifts. The suffering itself doesn't necessarily decrease. You still face difficulties, losses, disappointments, pains. But your relationship to it changes, and that changes everything. Tolstoy wrote that once he understood this, once he found a framework that made his suffering make sense, the suicidal despair lifted. Not because his life became easier. In many ways, it became harder, more conflicted, especially as his new convictions put him at odds with his family and society. But he was no longer drowning, no longer lost, no longer seeing his pain as proof that existence was absurd. Instead, he saw it as part of the journey, as the friction necessary for growth, as the price of becoming real. And this is ultimately what Tolstoy offers us. Not a way to eliminate suffering, but a way to make it meaningful. Not a promise that life will be easy, but a framework that makes even the hard parts purposeful. Not a guarantee of happiness in the superficial sense, but the possibility of something deeper, something that doesn't depend on circumstances, something that can't be taken away. He would say that this is what the soul is, that part of you that exists independent of your temporary circumstances. That can find meaning even in suffering. That connects you to something eternal and unchanging, even as everything around you changes. The final years of Tolstoy's life were strange and complicated. He became world famous not just as a novelist, but as a spiritual teacher. People came from all over to visit him, to ask his advice, to learn from him. But he was also increasingly at odds with his wife and family, who didn't share his radical convictions about how to live. And eventually, at age 82, he ran away from home in the middle of the night, apparently trying to live out his final days in accordance with his principles. He died a few days later in a railway station, surrounded by reporters and curious onlookers, separated from his family. It's a sad ending in some ways, but also somehow fitting for someone who spent his life insisting that you have to actually live your truth, not just talk about it. What Tolstoy leaves us with is this: your suffering is not evidence that something has gone wrong with your life. It's evidence that you're being called to something deeper, being invited to transform, being given the friction necessary to become who you're meant to be. The inevitable suffering of human existence can destroy you or remake you, and the difference lies entirely in how you understand it, how you respond to it, what you let it teach you. Tolstoy chose to let it remake him, to let it strip away illusions, and reveal what was real, to let it transform him from a lost, desperate, suicidal aristocrat into one of the most spiritually influential thinkers in history. And his message to us is clear. You can make the same choice, not once, but over and over, every time suffering appears, every time life strips away something you were holding on to, every time you're forced to confront the limitations of your current understanding. Each moment of suffering is an invitation to see more clearly, to let go of what isn't working, to build your life on something more solid than temporary pleasures and external validation. This is how Tolstoy turned pain into meaning, and this is how you can too.